I sometimes get asked by aspiring artists, what's the best painting medium if I want to have a successful career as an artist? Because there's a lot of different mediums to choose from. I'm going to really just focus today on three different mediums: watercolor, acrylic, and oils. And I'm going to give you my thoughts on those. And it actually depends where you are in your career, not surprisingly. And it also depends on what kind of a career you want to have to be able to decide which of these mediums might be best for you at certain stages in your career. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I do that, you could do me a big favor. If you want to help my channel grow and if you like the content and want me to keep producing videos like this, you can click on the subscribe button. You can give me a big thumbs up. You can actually click that little bell to get notified of any new videos when they get published. And again, my plan going forward is to publish a new video every Monday, every Thursday. And this is the channel if you are an aspiring artist who dreams of one day being able to create a decent living for you and your family by creating and selling your art. I'm Tim Packer, and I'm a fairly successful artist if you haven't seen any of my stuff before. Over the course of the last 20 years, I've generated earnings of over $2.5 million from the sale of my work. And typically now I earn around $200,000 a year from the sale of my work. So I kind of sort of know a little bit about this subject. But I get asked this topic a lot from aspiring artists because they want to know, like, if I want to have a very good career as an artist, what medium should I focus on? There's really no simple answer to that. What I can tell you is that you don't need to choose at the beginning of your career which one you're going to end up with, but there are certain ones that are better at a certain stage of your career. So let's talk about watercolor first. If you've seen any of my earlier videos, you might know that it's my philosophy that when you're starting out, so when you're kind of a beginner or even a serious hobbyist and you're starting trying to sell your work, the biggest thing you want to focus on is improving the quality of your art. And you do that by improving your skills, getting a lot of experience, improving your technical knowledge, improving your conceptual knowledge, things like composition. And the best way to do that is to create a lot of paintings. Now, for me, the best medium to do that in is watercolor, because typically when you're starting out, you don't want to be spending a lot of money on materials and you don't want the materials to be precious. And with watercolor, you can create a lot of paintings without investing a lot of money. You can buy one sheet of half decent watercolor, say a 200-pound rag paper. You can cut that up into eighth of a sheets, so about this size. And you can also paint on both sides of the paper. So you can create 16 different paintings for the cost of one sheet of paper. Now, if you're going to be painting on canvas or panel or anything like that, each little panel will probably cost you the same amount as a full sheet of watercolor paper. The other thing that I like about watercolor is it is the easiest in terms of setup, cleanup, everything like that. So typically when you're starting out, you don't have your own studio, a huge dedicated space for you and your work. You often have to set up quickly or take down, or you only have a very small space in which to work. And with watercolor, you can achieve a permanent workspace in a very small space, and it's very easy to get started. You just re-wet your brushes, re-wet your paints, and kind of dive right in. And when you're finished, you just rinse your brushes off, and then you can just leave. So watercolor is a great medium to start with because the ease of setup, because of the relatively cheap cost per painting as you're learning. But it also is one of the technically most difficult mediums to master, especially if you're painting in transparent watercolor, because one bad brush stroke can ruin a painting. In oils or acrylics, we have the ability of wiping paint off or kind of painting over top. But when you're painting in transparent watercolor, every single stroke shows through. So one bad brushstroke can ruin a painting. But that's also one of the benefits of watercolor because it makes you learn to paint correctly, accurately the first time. I see a lot of artists, they're very, very sloppy starting out, and then they spend forever trying to fix all their mistakes. I think it's a much better strategy to paint, to try and paint accurately and correctly at the beginning stages of the painting while you're laying out your major shapes. And then that allows you to be much freer and looser as you go on in the process because you're confident in what you've already laid down. And so the thing about watercolor is it's a great medium to use when you want to learn. You're also going to learn color theory, again, because we don't paint in opaque colors in watercolor. So the end color that you end up seeing is a result of all the colors that are layered on the paper. So I would really recommend for someone starting out, if you don't want to invest a huge amount of money, you want to be able to create a lot of paintings, and you really want to hone those skills, I think watercolor is actually the best medium for when you're learning. But there are some downsides to watercolor once you get to a certain level in your career and if you're trying to make a living. And so the first one is that typically watercolors have to be covered by glass. And most clients don't like that because if you have a watercolor on a wall and there's a window opposite, all you're going to see in that glass is the reflection of the window. It also makes the paintings very heavy, especially if you want to create extra large paintings. If you want to create a 4 foot by 6 foot watercolor, well, first of all, that's an incredible task alone, but the frame is probably going to weigh 400 or 500 pounds by the time you frame it and put glass in front of it. And framing watercolors can be quite expensive. So once you actually start reaching the point where you're going to start selling your work, it can actually be more expensive for you per painting by the time you actually put a frame on it. So that's the downside of watercolors in terms of kind of at the end of your career. But there's also a potential positive side, and that is that most artists, most hobbyist artists actually paint in watercolor. So if you want to earn your living or part of your living by teaching workshops, and you can actually earn a very, very good living doing that, becoming very, very skilled in watercolor and in teaching watercolor can earn you a very, very good living. Not only that, most of the very successful watercolor instructors that I know, they also sell their paintings to their students. And so they just sell the sheet of paper, so they don't incur those framing costs. So you certainly can develop a very successful career as a watercolor painter. And those who reach the absolute highest level, their work also sells in the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. So the framing costs don't really become an issue when you look at the price of the actual painting. But that is a very, very small percentage and the very highest percentile of watercolor painters who can actually earn a very good living from the sale of their watercolors. Now let's look at oils. Oils have been around just about the longest. Egg tempera is actually the oldest painting medium, going back to the Egyptians, but oils have been around for almost a couple thousand years. Now, the great thing about oils is you don't need to put any glass in front of them. You simply varnish them. The other thing about them is if you're painting on canvas, they're very, very light. So you can create huge paintings without having the huge weight like you would get with watercolor. The other thing about oils that is kind of neat is you can wipe off your mistakes. You can make corrections. You can paint over top of areas. So you're less likely to have a fatal error 5 hours or 10 hours into an oil painting than you are for a watercolor. The other thing that I found was And I guess I should just mention here that like I've achieved a very high degree of mastery in both watercolor and oils. So I was elected to the Canadian Society of Painters and Watercolor and actually served on the board and as president. But I've made most of my living in the last 20 years through selling my oil paintings through galleries, and more recently, almost exclusively online. So the thing that I like about oils, aside from just the different things about using them, is if you are doing festivals. So that's actually when I made the switch from watercolors to oils. I was doing a lot of art festivals. And so I was taking my work on the road. I was exhibiting it outside in the elements. And watercolors are very, very fragile and very easy to damage, not only just from rain or things like that, but even sunlight can cause condensation on the back of the glass, which can cause then your mats to get destroyed, or can cause actually the paint to run if it gets enough and drips on the painting. Whereas oils are pretty indestructible. Once they're dry, there's not a really big problem. And the other thing that I loved, and maybe I'll just take this piece off here to show you. So this is actually how I create my paintings now. So this is on a canvas with the wide gallery wrap. And you can see here, all I've done is painted the edges black. And I started doing that when I was out on the festival circuit, mainly just for cost. If you're starting out as an artist, cash flow is a really big problem. If you've got 30 paintings and it's going to cost you, say, $250 each to frame them, that's a lot of money you've got tied up in frames. And also when you take them on the road, they get banged up and dinged up, and then you've got to replace the frames, or you also have clients wanting to change the frames. So simply by painting the edges of the canvas black, I got away from the need to frame my work. And what actually ended up happening is most of my clients now prefer that look. So I do occasionally frame pieces for clients. I will do that. But most of the people who buy my work actually hang it like that. And especially if you're in kind of fairly newer or modern homes, that look is really in now. So that's the thing I really loved about oils. And also, there is a bit of a bias amongst clients that for the most part, they are willing to spend more on an oil than they are on a watercolor. Now, that doesn't apply to those artists that are at the highest level, whose work commands huge prices. But just on average, a client is willing to spend more for an oil the size of this piece than for a watercolor of the same size. There's a problem with oils though, and that was what initially led me to start painting in watercolor, is that if you're using traditional oils and you're using the solvents to clean your brushes, then those can actually have a really harmful health effect, the fumes, just breathing them in. And for me, my son had asthma when he was born, so that made me switch from painting in oils to watercolor. And then what came about, which actually kind of was probably the biggest break I ever got in my career, is they now have something called water soluble oils or water miscible oils. And these are oils where you don't need solvents to clean the paints. You can clean your brushes using soap and water. They also make water soluble oil mediums of various different thicknesses and viscosity. So by using these, you can kind of avoid that potential hazard of using traditional oils and the solvents involved. Now, I do also have to say, though, I have come across some artist friends of mine that even the water soluble oils, they can't handle the fumes that come off the oil paint mediums, even though they are much, much less than what you would get with traditional oils and using the traditional solvents. So that's kind of the benefit of working in the oils, the ability to work on canvas, to work very large and have the pieces still very light. The finished works are much, much more durable and less prone to damage than watercolors. And then let's move to acrylics. So acrylics are kind of somewhat in the middle. Acrylics can behave very much like watercolor if you dilute them with water or with special acrylic mediums, but you can also apply them just like oils. The main difference in acrylics is they dry much faster. So whereas oils might take 3 days to a couple weeks to dry. Typically, your acrylics are going to dry in a few minutes to maybe a half hour, depending on the temperature and the humidity. So if you like to work quickly and you like to work a lot, one layer over another with letting it dry, then acrylics might actually be kind of the best choice for you. Now, they also have come out with a new style of acrylics, and I know Golden in particular has these. They're called open acrylics, and these are kind of halfway between traditional acrylics and oils. They take several hours to dry, not minutes. So if you found that acrylics dry too quickly for you, you might want to try the open acrylics, or you might want to try moving to the water soluble oils. And as I said, the great thing about acrylics is, we not only clean our brushes with soap and water, but you actually dilute the paint with water. You can paint them very much like watercolors, or you can paint them like oils. So what is the best medium? Well, again, it depends where you are in your career. So again, for someone starting off who doesn't want to invest an awful lot of money or an awful lot of space in kind of studio space, then I think watercolor is a great place to start. It's also a great way to hone your skills, not only your painting and drawing skills, but your knowledge of color theory and things like that. If you also decide that you really want to get into the teaching circuit, then watercolor is probably the best medium that will allow you to earn a very decent living, not only through teaching workshops, but also through selling your work to your students. And again, in that case, you don't need to frame them. Most of the artists that I know, they carry a big portfolio with a lot of their recent pieces, and often they'll sell pieces before the demo is even completed. If you want to paint great big paintings, then I think oils or acrylics are probably your best bet. And by painting them on canvas, you can create huge paintings that aren't incredibly heavy. They're also much easier to kind of transport if you're doing the festival circuit. They don't get damaged nearly as easily. And if they do, they're easy to just touch up. We can just paint over top. And the other great thing about oils or even acrylics is typically the average client is willing to spend a little more for an acrylic or an oil than they are for a watercolor. And because of that, you might find it easier getting into a gallery if you focus on oils or acrylics. So again, I think if you're selling your work, it's a much easier go selling oils or acrylics if they're painted like oils. But if you really want to get into teaching, I think watercolor's a better bet. And there is also the potential to earn a very decent living as a watercolor painter, but you need to be in that 99.99th percentile in terms of your skill as a watercolor painter to actually get clients to pay you the huge bucks. So what is the best medium to paint in? Well, like everything else, it depends. If you are interested in selling your work, then I have a free webinar that I've created that you can watch for free. You can just go to www.aspiringartist.ca, and that is the opt-in site for the webinar. There's one running every 15 minutes, and that'll tell you the 10 keys that I think are really important if you want to have success in selling your work. I've created a whole series of videos on becoming a successful artist that you might want to check out. And once again, if you like my content and you want me to keep producing videos, give me a thumbs up, push that subscribe button, and maybe even click that bell so you'll get notified of future videos.